A hidden knife buried beneath silence. Welcome to Mystery Sherlock. I am your host, Edward Sterling. Drop a comment sharing where you're listening from. I enjoy reading them all. Now, the truth comes out. In glancing over my notes of those singular adventures which it has been my privilege to share with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have often been struck by the curious disproportion between the trivial appearance of an incident at its outset and the grave consequences which may hang upon it. A scrap of ash, a footprint upon a sill, a forgotten cufflink, or the turn of a phrase upon trembling lips, such things have before now proved the hinges upon which large destinies have swung. It is for this reason that I preserve with as much fidelity as a memory and manuscript permit not only the broad facts of a case, but those minor circumstances which, to the ordinary observer, seem unworthy of notice. Of all the affairs in which Holmes was engaged during the latter part of the year 1894, there is none which left a deeper impression upon my mind than that which I have titled The Case of the Knife Beneath the Floorboard. I do not refer merely to the ingenious nature of the mystery, though that was notable enough, nor to the position of the persons concerned, though here again there were elements which would have excited the curiosity of society had the truth become public. What gave the matter its sombre character was the cold deliberation with which every stage of the crime had been arranged, so that even now, after the lapse of years, I cannot think of it without recalling the keen, ascetic face of Holmes bent over the fire, and the singular sentence with which he first announced that our visitor's tale concealed more than the visitor himself suspected. It was upon a raw November evening, with a yellow fog clinging low to Baker Street and pressing against the panes like some foul London spirit seeking entry, that the affair began. Holmes had spent the greater part of the day in one of those alternating conditions of lethargy and sudden activity which so often mark the intervals between his cases. At one time he had lain for an hour together upon the sofa with closed eyes and fingertips joined, so motionless that one might have mistaken him for a man in deep sleep. At another he would spring up, pace the room with long, nervous strides, and cast himself again into his chair with some impatient ejaculation at the dullness of the age. What I had been reading near the lamp, a monograph upon tropical fevers, having failed to hold my attention against the dreary insistence of the weather, when Holmes suddenly extended his hand toward my side table. "Your watch, Watson." I passed it to him without remark, for I had long ceased to be surprised by these abrupt demands. He held it to the light, turned it over once or twice, and then smiled in that faint, inward fashion which told me his analytical faculties had found exercise. "You have had a visitor in your surgery this afternoon." As it happens, I had three. "A military man among them?" "Yes." "Retired artillery, I should say, with a daughter of marriageable age and a nervous disorder which he disguises beneath bluster." I laid down my book and stared at him. "My dear Holmes!" He tossed the watch back to me. "The thing is simplicity itself. Your key has scratched the inner case in a fashion which shows recent haste. You only treat such haste with patients who know you well enough to come by the side entrance. The minute grains of reddish dust in the hinge are not London clay, but the ferruginous powder common enough upon the parade grounds at Woolwich. The military connection is therefore likely. The watch has also the faint odour of a particularly cheap but vigorous cigar, such as is favoured by elderly officers of limited means. Finally, there is the narrow smear of violet upon the edge, not yours, Watson, for you affect no such adornment. It is a girl's glove dye transferred when the young lady, in agitation, clasped your hand while her father talked, over loudly in order to conceal his concern. I could not but laugh. The artilleryman and his daughter are correct. As for the nervous disorder, Holmes waved his hand. A man who speaks as if on parade in a consulting room is rarely at ease. "You are certainly right there," said I. "The daughter was indeed anxious." "Because the father is a tyrant?" "On the contrary, because he is kind." Holmes closed his eyes. "Ah, then the matter concerns money or marriage. Kind fathers do not alarm dutiful daughters save through helplessness." Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson entered, with that mingled firmness and respect which Holmes somehow inspired even in the practical Scotchwoman. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says the matter is of the greatest urgency." "At this hour?" said I, glancing at the clock, which wanted 9:15. "He seemed very set upon it, sir. A respectable gentleman, though somewhat distressed." "Show him up," said Holmes, and as the landlady withdrew, he added in a lower tone, "Observe, Watson, our evening promises improvement." The visitor who was ushered into our sitting-room was a man of perhaps 45, of middle height, spare build, and excellent dress. His overcoat was of fine dark cloth, his boots of the best quality, and his linen irreproachable. Yet the general effect was not that of comfort, but of restraint. His face was pale and clean-shaven, with a high, narrow nose, lips compressed from habit rather than temper, and a pair of deep-set grey eyes which shifted rapidly from Holmes to myself and back again, as though he weighed at once what he might say and what he had best conceal. In his right hand he carried a pair of grey gloves. It was not until later that I recalled how tightly he held them, with the knuckles whitened under the skin. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he. Holmes inclined his head from the armchair. "And Dr. Watson, I presume? You will forgive this intrusion. My name is Alistair Pencombe." Holmes motioned him to a seat. "You come from Bloomsbury," said he, "though you did not start there." Our visitor stopped short in the act of sitting. "Indeed, sir?" "You took a hansom from Euston Road after leaving a railway terminus with some reluctance, and you considered before coming here whether you ought not first to have gone to the police." The man lowered himself slowly into the chair. "This is extraordinary." "It is observation. The hem of your trouser is marked by the yellowish splash of recent road mud thrown high, which suggests a fast cab. And the left cuff bears a trace of black grease from the inner handle of a railway carriage, and there is chalk upon your sleeve, such as one still sees in the cloakroom passages at certain stations. As to the police, your hat has been taken off and put on again 3 or 4 times within the hour. A man does that when debating a course of action." Mr. Pencombe gave a weary smile, though I could see that his nerves were near fraying. "I have heard of your methods, Mr. Holmes, but I confess I was not prepared for such a display of them. Since concealment is useless, I shall be frank, at least as frank as I am able." Holmes leaned back and half closed his eyes. "That qualification is worth noting," said he. "Proceed." Our client moistened his lips. "I have come on behalf of Mrs. Eugenia Vane, a widow residing at Marchfield House, near Highgate. I am her solicitor." Here Holmes opened one eye. "Not family solicitor?" "No, a confidential adviser in certain private matters." "Better and better," murmured Holmes. Pencombe shot him a quick glance, as if unsure whether he was being mocked. Holmes's face, however, remained one of grave attention. "3 nights ago," continued the solicitor, "there occurred in that house a most shocking discovery. Mrs. Vane's nephew, Mr. Adrian Vane, who has lived with her for the past year, was found dead in the old morning room at the rear of the ground floor." "By what means?" I asked. "He had been stabbed, Dr. Watson. Once only, but with terrible force, in the region of the heart." I observed Holmes's fingers come together. "Was robbery suggested?" "No." "Suicide impossible?" "Entirely impossible." or the wound was such that no man could have inflicted it upon himself in that manner. Besides, he hesitated. Yes. The knife was not found in the body nor anywhere in the room. Holmes sat forward a little. That is curious, very curious. Pray continue. Mrs. Vane had retired early with a headache. The servants had supped below stairs. Mr. Adrian was believed to be in the morning room, where he often smoked and read after dinner. At about 11:30, the butler, noticing that the lamp still burned, went to secure the shutters and found him stretched upon the carpet beside the hearth. There had been no cry, no sound of struggle. Only after the alarm was raised did the household discover that a narrow side door leading to the garden stood unlatched. "That would appear plain enough," said I. "An intruder enters, commits the deed, and escapes by the same route." Pencomb turned to me with an eagerness which betrayed how strongly he desired some simple explanation. "That has indeed been the general view." "But not yours," said Holmes. The solicitor's face darkened. "I scarcely know what my view may be. There are circumstances, domestic circumstances, which render the matter deplorably delicate. Adrian Vane was not universally liked. He was a man of charm, certainly, but impulsive, extravagant, and, I fear, in debt. Mrs. Vane's companion, Miss Lydia Hartwell, had on more than one occasion quarrelled with him. So also had Mrs. Vane's steward, Mr. Felix Crowell, with whom he disputed over money. The servants disliked him. In short, there is no lack of persons upon whom suspicion might settle. "You speak," said Holmes softly, "as a man reciting the official possibilities rather than his own conviction." Mr. Pencomb gave a start. "My own conviction, Mr. Holmes, is exactly what I mistrust. It is because of that mistrust that I am here." Holmes was silent for some moments. The fog swirled thickly outside, and from far down Baker Street there came the muffled rattle of wheels and the cry of a newsboy borne strangely through the vapour. At last Holmes said, "You have not yet told us the reason why Scotland Yard, competent enough in straightforward crimes, should be supplemented by my services." Pencomb passed his hand over his brow. His composure, which had thus far seemed the result of effort, now visibly weakened. "Because," said he, "the police believe they are close to an arrest. Inspector Lestrade himself has already visited Marchfield House twice, but their attention is directed, indeed, almost fixed, upon Miss Hartwell." "The companion?" "Yes." "On what grounds?" "Her quarrels with the dead man, a stained cuff found in the passage, and the fact that she was seen near the morning room shortly before 11. "That is certainly awkward," said I. "It is ruinous," cried Pencomb. "Miss Hartwell is innocent." Holmes's expression did not change. "You know that?" "I believe it." "A weaker position." "Yes, but I believe it utterly." "Why?" For the first time the solicitor lost command of himself. He half rose from his chair, the grey gloves twisting in his hands. "Because if she had done it," he burst out, "she would never have left the thing where it was found." Holmes's eyes flashed. "The thing!" Pencomb stood rigid, as though he had betrayed more than he intended, and his face had gone from pale to ashen. "You have omitted something from your account," said Holmes in a voice suddenly keen as steel. Yes, that is to say, there was another development." "State it." "The murder weapon was discovered this morning." "Ah," said Holmes, "not by the police. Not officially, at least. A carpenter was called to examine a warped board in the morning-room floor, near the skirting by the hearth. When the board was lifted, there was found beneath it a narrow cavity between the joists. In that cavity lay a knife." "The knife," I repeated. Pencomb bowed his head. "It was stained. There can be no doubt it was the weapon used." "And why," said Holmes, each word clipped and precise, "was this not the first fact you gave us?" The solicitor sank back into his chair like a man exhausted by inward struggle. Because, mister,
Was Holmes, what was found with the knife was worse than the knife itself. Holmes did not speak. Mr. Pencombe looked from one to the other of us, and in the silence I heard the sharp hiss of the coals settling in the grate. There was also, said he in a whisper, a scrap of paper bearing Miss Hartwell's name. Holmes rose in a single fluid movement and stood with his back to the fire, his thin hands clasped behind him, his head bent. I knew that attitude well. It meant that every faculty within him had narrowed to a point. "Watson," said he at last, "I think we shall pay a visit to Marchfield House in the morning." He turned to Pencombe. "You have done wisely to come. Whether you have come in time is another matter." And so, with that ominous sentence,
Holmes began one of the darkest and most subtle inquiries in which I ever saw Sherlock Holmes engaged. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I entered the sitting-room the following morning, though the grey light beyond the curtains suggested an hour earlier than his custom. The remains of a hurried meal lay before him, untouched in part, while his long, nervous fingers toyed with a sheet of notepaper covered in rapid, angular writing. He did not look up as I approached. "You have slept, Watson?" he asked. "Soundly enough, though I cannot say the same for my thoughts. The case has fixed itself upon my mind." "As it should," said he. "It possesses the elements of interest, a concealed weapon, a compromised suspect, and, most suggestive of all, a man who omits facts until pressed. Such omissions are rarely accidental." "You refer to Mr. Pencombe?" "I do. Our friend is either withholding information to protect another or to protect himself. In either case, we must proceed with caution. There is more in this affair than a simple stabbing." He rose abruptly and drew back the curtain. The fog of the previous evening had thinned but not vanished. It hung now in pale ribbons across the street, lending an air of unreality to the passing figures below. "We shall go at once," he continued. "Marchfield House lies sufficiently near that we may observe the neighbourhood before the household is fully astir. It is often in those first unguarded hours that truth leaves its clearest traces." Within the half-hour we were seated in a hansom, the horses' hooves striking a steady rhythm upon the damp roadway as we made our way northward. Holmes spoke little during the journey, though I observed that his eyes missed nothing. Twice he leaned forward to peer intently at a passer-by. Once he tapped upon the glass and directed the driver to alter our route by a side street, only to resume the original course moments later. When I questioned him, he merely smiled. "One must know not only where one goes, Watson, but what one passes in going." Marchfield House proved to be a large and somewhat austere residence, set back from the road behind iron gates and a sweep of gravel drive. The grounds, though not extensive, were well kept, with a small lawn bordered by leafless shrubs and a line of dark yew trees which gave the place a sombre aspect. The house itself was of red brick, with tall windows and a projecting wing at the rear, the position, I surmised, of the morning room. As we descended from the cab, the front door was opened by a tall, grave man in black, whose rigid bearing proclaimed him at once as the butler. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," said Holmes, handing his card. "We are expected." The man inclined his head with a formality that bordered upon severity. "Mr. Pencombe is within, sir. This way, if you please." We were conducted through a broad hall, panelled in dark wood and hung with several portraits of a severe and aristocratic cast. There was an air of restraint throughout the house, as though even the furnishings observed a certain discipline. In the drawing-room we found Mr. Pencombe awaiting us, his appearance more worn than on the previous evening. "You are prompt," said he, rising. "I am grateful for it." Holmes greeted him briefly. Before we proceed further,
I should like to see the room in which the crime occurred. Pencomb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then rang the bell. Barnes will show you. I shall join you presently. The butler reappeared as if summoned by the mere thought of his name. Without a word, he led us down a corridor toward the rear of the house. As we walked, Holmes's gaze moved from carpet to wall to ceiling, noting, as I knew, every trifling irregularity. You discovered the body? He said suddenly. Yes, sir. At 11:30. A few minutes after, sir. You entered by the main door? Yes, sir. And the side door to the garden was unlatched? It was, sir. Holmes nodded but asked no further question. We had reached the morning room. It was a long, low chamber, comfortably furnished with a wide hearth at one end and a writing table near the window.
the shutters were now open, admitting a pale and wintry light which fell across the carpet in dull patches. It required little imagination to picture the scene as it must have appeared 3 nights before. Holmes stood for some moments upon the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping the room. Then he stepped inside with that peculiar, noiseless tread which I had so often admired. "The body lay here?" he asked, indicating a spot near the hearth. "Yes, sir." Holmes crouched, examining the carpet closely. He touched it lightly with his fingers, then rose and moved to the skirting board. "This is where the board was lifted?" "Yes, sir." At Holmes's request, the butler fetched a small tool and loosened the board once more. The narrow cavity beneath was revealed, a dark, confined space between the joists. Holmes knelt and peered within,
Then inserted his hand and felt along the edges with the utmost care. When he withdrew it, there was a faint smile upon his lips. "Interesting," said he. "What do you observe?" I asked. "Absence, Watson, a very eloquent absence." Before I could press him further, there came a light step in the passage, and a young woman entered the room. She was of slight build, with dark hair and a pale, composed face which might have been called beautiful but for the shadow of strain that lay upon it. Her eyes rested upon Holmes with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "I am Lydia Hartwell. I understand you have come regarding my unfortunate position." Holmes bowed. "I have come, Miss Hartwell, to understand the truth. Whether it proves fortunate or otherwise must depend upon the facts." She drew a breath, steadying herself.
Then I shall tell you everything." Holmes glanced once more at the open floorboard, then turned to her. "I trust you will," said he quietly. "For I suspect that what lies beneath this floor is not the most dangerous thing concealed in this house." Miss Hartwell remained standing for a moment after Holmes had spoken, as though steadying herself against the weight of what must follow. Then, with a visible effort, she crossed the room and seated herself near the writing table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could not but observe the pallor of her face, nor the quiet dignity with which she bore herself in so trying a situation. "You will forgive me," she said, "if I am not as composed as I might wish. These last days have been most distressing." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Pray take your time, Miss Hartwell, as accuracy is of more value than haste." She glanced once toward the butler, who still lingered by the door. "Barnes, you may leave us." The man bowed and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. The faint click of the latch seemed to deepen the silence that followed. "You understand, Mr. Holmes," she began, "that I am already under suspicion. Inspector Lestrade has made that abundantly clear. I have nothing to conceal, yet everything I say appears to be twisted into evidence against me." "That is frequently the misfortune of innocence," said Holmes. "It lacks the ready-made explanations which guilt prepares in advance." She gave him a quick, searching look, as if to determine whether he spoke in sympathy or irony, but his expression was unreadable. "You were acquainted with Mr. Adrian Vane?" Holmes continued. "I too well," she answered quietly. "He was my cousin, distantly, and Mrs. Vane's nephew, as you know. When I came to live here as her companion, I had not seen him for years. He returned soon after, and from the first there was friction." "In what form?" "He was charming when he chose to be, but his temper was uncertain. He resented my presence, I think, or perhaps," she hesitated, "perhaps he resented that I did not admire him as others did." Holmes made a small gesture. "Go on." "He was often in debt. I know this because he came to me twice to ask that I intercede with Mrs. Vane on his behalf. I refused. It was not my place, and I did not trust him." "You quarrelled?" "Yes." "Violently?" Her eyes flashed for the first time. "He forced it so. On the evening of his death we had words in this very room. And he accused me of influencing his aunt against him. I told him plainly that his own conduct was the cause of her displeasure." "At what hour was this?" "Shortly before 10. And after that, I left him here and went to my room." Holmes's gaze had not left her face. "You did not return?" "No." "You are certain?" She rose slightly in her chair. "Mr. Holmes, I may be under suspicion, but I am not a liar." Holmes inclined his head again. "I do not accuse you, Miss Hartwell. I test the strength of your statement." She sank back, though her composure had been shaken. "I did not return," she repeated more quietly. Holmes turned to the writing table and examined its surface with casual interest. "You were seen in the passage near this room at about 11 o'clock. Her hands tightened once more. "I went to fetch a book from the small library."
"And it lies beyond the morning room. I did not enter here." "And yet," said Holmes softly, "a stain was found upon your cuff." She closed her eyes for an instant. "Yes, I cannot explain it." "Not at all?" "No." Holmes said nothing for a moment. He moved slowly across the room to the hearth and stood looking down at the spot where the body had lain. "When the knife was discovered beneath the floor," he said at last, "there was, as I understand, a scrap of paper bearing your name." She rose again, this time with unmistakable agitation. "Yes." "How came it there?" "I do not know." Her voice broke, and for the first time the strain overcame her. She turned away, one hand pressed to her forehead. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I have never seen that knife. I have never touched it. I have never placed anything beneath that floor." Someone wishes to ruin me." Holmes watched her intently. "Who?" She shook her head. "I cannot say. Mr. Crowle dislikes me, but not to that extent. The servants know. Mrs. Vane trusts me. There is no one—" She stopped suddenly, as though struck by a thought she dared not pursue. Holmes stepped forward. "You were about to name someone." "No?" "Yes, you checked yourself. Why?" She met his gaze, and in her eyes I saw not only fear, but something deeper, uncertainty, struggling with conviction. "Because," she said slowly, "it would be absurd." Holmes's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "In my experience, Miss Hartwell, the absurd is often the key to the truth." There was a pause, long and heavy. At last she spoke. "If I must say it, then it is Mr. Pencombe. I confess that I started at this," and even Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "He, the solicitor," said he. "Yes, he has been here frequently of late on business with Mrs. Vane. He and Adrian quarrelled more than once, and yet—" She faltered again. "And yet," Holmes prompted, "and yet he was the one who insisted that you be called in," she finished. "Why would he do so if he were guilty?" Holmes turned away, his expression once more veiled. "An excellent question," said he. Then, after a moment's silence, and one which, I think, we shall not answer by remaining in this room." Holmes moved at once toward the door, pausing only to replace the loosened board with a care so deliberate that it impressed itself upon my mind even at the time. Miss Hartwell watched him with an anxious expectancy, as though her fate hung upon the direction he might next take. "You will remain here for the present," said he to her. Say nothing of what has passed between us. Above all, do not allow yourself to be drawn into further explanations with the police until we have had time to consider the matter." She inclined her head, though I could see that the effort cost her something. "You believe me, then?" she asked. Holmes did not answer the question directly. "I believe," said he, "that you have not yet told me everything which you know. Whether that is from caution or from fear remains to be seen." With that he opened the door and stepped into the passage. I followed him, and we were immediately joined by Mr. Pencombe, who had evidently been waiting within call. "Well," said he quickly, "you have spoken with Miss Hartwell?" "We have." "And your impression?" Holmes regarded him with that calm, penetrating gaze which I had seen unnerve stronger men.
My impression," said he, "is that this house contains more secrets than its inhabitants are aware of." Pencombe forced a smile, though it sat ill upon his face. "You will find no opposition from me in that conclusion." "Good. Then perhaps you will assist us further. I should like to see Mrs. Vane." The solicitor hesitated. "She's not well. The shock has not improved with concealment," said Holmes. "You will oblige me." After a brief pause, Pencombe bowed. "As you wish." We were conducted upstairs to a large chamber overlooking the grounds. The curtains were partially drawn, and the subdued light lent the room an air of quiet melancholy. Mrs. Eugenia Vane lay upon a chaise near the window, supported by cushions. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with a pale, refined face, and silver hair drawn smoothly back. Her eyes, though weary, retained a certain firmness of character which suggested that she had not always been the invalid she now appeared. "Mr. Holmes," she said faintly as we entered, "Mr. Pencombe has told me of your visit. If you can bring clarity to this dreadful affair, you will have my deepest gratitude." Holmes bowed. "I shall do what I can, madam, but I must ask you to recall as precisely as possible the events of that evening." She closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering her strength. "I retired early, as you have been told. My head was aching severely. I saw Adrian at dinner. He was in one of his restless moods. There had been some disagreement, I believe, though I was not present for it." "With whom?" "I cannot say. With Miss Hartwell, perhaps, or with Mr. Crowell. There was always some friction of late." "And Mr.?"
"Pencombe?" asked Holmes quietly. Her eyes opened at once. "Mr. Pencombe? No, at least not that I observed." Holmes made no comment, but I saw that he had marked the quickness of her response. "You heard nothing during the night?" "Nothing. I was given a draught by my maid and slept until I was awakened by Barnes." "At what hour?" "Shortly before midnight." "And since then?" She gave a faint shudder. "Since then I have lived in a nightmare." Holmes stepped nearer to the window and looked out across the grounds. "This side door, which was found unlatched," said he, "is it commonly used?" "Rarely. It opens upon the garden, but we prefer the main entrance." "Was it locked earlier in the evening?" "I believe so." "Who would have access to it?" "The servants and Adrian." Holmes turned. "No one else?" She hesitated, then glanced toward Pencombe.
Well, Mr. Pencombe has used it on occasion, when arriving late on business." The solicitor shifted slightly, but said nothing. Holmes nodded. "I see. And the morning-room floor, has it ever been repaired or altered?" "Not to my knowledge." No carpenter has been called in recently? No. Holmes was silent for a moment, then inclined his head. You have been most helpful, madam. Pray do not fatigue yourself further. As we withdrew, I could not resist glancing back. Mrs. Vane had turned her face toward the window once more, her expression one of profound weariness. In the corridor, Holmes paused and laid a hand upon my arm. You observe, Watson? I observe, said I, that suspicion now rests upon nearly every member of the household, including the man who summoned us. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Just so, and yet, curiously enough,
The one person who ought to be most anxious for concealment has taken the greatest pains to expose the matter. You mean Pencombe? I mean, said Holmes, that our solicitor has played a bold game, perhaps too bold. He moved on again, his step quickening. Come. There remains one part of the house which we have not yet examined, and it is there, I think, that the first real thread of this tangled skein may be found. I followed Holmes without further question, though I confess that my curiosity had now reached a point of considerable tension. His manner had altered subtly but unmistakably. There was in his step that quick, decisive energy which I had learned to associate with the scent of a definite clue. Whatever vague suspicions had guided him thus far were now, I felt sure, beginning to crystallize.
He led the way not toward the principal rooms of the house, but down a narrower passage branching from the main corridor, a service way dimly lit and plainly furnished. The air here was cooler, tinged with the faint odour of polish and damp stone. The library lies beyond the morning room, Miss Hartwell told us, said I. Precisely, returned Holmes, and she also told us that she passed along this passage at 11 o'clock. That fact, Watson, is of more consequence than she perhaps realizes. We came presently to a small door, which Holmes opened without ceremony. Within was a modest room lined with shelves, the books arranged with an orderliness that suggested more care than use. A single window admitted a grey light, and a narrow table stood in the centre, bearing a lamp and a few scattered volumes. T. Holmes crossed at once to the table and examined the lamp. "Lit last night," said he. "Not recently, but within a day or two. The wick is trimmed with care. Someone uses this room habitually." "Miss Hartwell, perhaps?" "Possibly, but she's not alone in that habit." He turned to the shelves and ran his long fingers lightly along their edges. Here and there he paused, drawing out a volume only to replace it again after a cursory glance. "Observe the dust," said he. "Uniform upon the upper shelves, disturbed upon the lower. A man of middle height would reach thus far without effort. A shorter person would favour the central tiers. You infer that more than one person frequents the room?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I infer that habits betray themselves even in trifles." He moved to the window and examined the latch. Unremarkable," he murmured. "No sign of recent tampering." Then, with a sudden change of direction, he dropped to one knee and inspected the carpet near the door. "Here we have something more to the purpose." I joined him. "What do you see?" "A slight indentation, twice repeated, just within the threshold. The marks of a narrow heel worn somewhat to the outer edge. Not a servant's shoe, too fine." "A lady's, then?" "Not necessarily. There are men who affect such footwear, but the repetition is interesting. It suggests hesitation, a pause before entering or leaving." "On the night of the crime," Holmes rose, "or at some other time equally significant." At that moment there came a sound behind us, and we turned to find Mr. Pencombe standing in the doorway. He had entered so quietly that neither of us had heard his approach. "Or you interest yourself in the library, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "For the moment." "It contains nothing of value, I assure you." "That remains to be seen." Pencomb stepped into the room, his gaze moving briefly about it before returning to Holmes. "You will forgive me if I say that your methods are somewhat obscure. You pass from one part of the house to another without apparent sequence." Holmes's expression did not change. "On the contrary, Mr. Pencomb, my sequence is exact. It is only the connections which are not yet visible to you." The solicitor's lips tightened. "I trust they will soon become so. As do I." There was a brief silence, during which I became aware of a certain tension between the two men, subtle but unmistakable. It was as though each measured the other, not in open challenge, but in quiet appraisal. Holmes broke it. "You have had frequent occasion to visit this house of late, I believe?" "Yes." "On business with Mrs. Vane?" "Exclusively." "And yet you were acquainted with her nephew?" "I knew him, of course." "You quarrelled with him?" Pencomb's eyes hardened. "I should not characterize it so. We differed upon certain matters." "Financial matters?" "If you choose." Holmes nodded slowly. "A pity," said he, "for such differences have a way of leaving traces, sometimes in accounts, sometimes elsewhere." Pencomb made a slight, impatient gesture. "I fail to see how this advances the inquiry." Holmes turned away, as though dismissing the point. "Perhaps it does not. Let us return to the morning room." We passed again into the passage, Pencomb following close behind. As we approached the door, Holmes paused abruptly and glanced down. "What is it?" I asked. Without replying, he stooped and picked up a small object from the floor, a fragment of something thin and white. He held it to the light. "A scrap of paper," said I. "Yes," said Holmes quietly. "And not an old one." He turned it over in his fingers, his eyes narrowing. "Watson," he added, "we may be nearer to the truth than our friend would find convenient." Pencomb gave a short laugh, though there was no mirth in it. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, nothing would please me more than the truth." Holmes slipped the fragment into his pocket. "I wonder," said he softly, "whether you would say the same when we have found it." Holmes did not speak again until we had returned to Baker Street that evening. Throughout the journey, he maintained a silence so complete that I knew his mind to be wholly occupied. Once only he drew from his pocket the scrap of paper he had discovered in the passage, smoothing it upon his knee and studying it with that intense, inward concentration which I had learned never to disturb. It was not until we were seated once more before the familiar fire at Baker Street that he turned to me with that peculiar brightness in his eyes which always heralded the culmination of his reasoning. "Watson," said he, "you have all the essential facts. Let us see whether you can arrange them." "I confess," said I, "that the case has grown only more perplexing. Miss Hartwell is clearly being incriminated, yet I can see no direct proof of her guilt. The knife beneath the floorboard, the scrap bearing her name,
Yes, her presence near the room. These are damning, yet somehow too deliberate." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Too deliberate. What does that suggest?" "That she has been framed." Holmes inclined his head. "And by whom?" I hesitated. "Mr. Crowle, perhaps, or—" I paused, recalling Miss Hartwell's words. "Or Mr. Pencomb." Holmes smiled faintly. "Let us examine Mr. Pencomb. He is a solicitor accustomed to method, to foresight, to the arrangement of facts in such a way as to produce a desired conclusion. He is also a frequent visitor to the house, with access to the side door and knowledge of the household's habits. He quarrelled with the deceased over financial matters. Already we have motive, means, and opportunity." "But why summon us?" I asked. "Why draw attention to himself?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "Because, my dear Watson—"
He did not summon me to conceal the crime. He summoned me to control its interpretation." I stared at him. To ensure that suspicion settled firmly and irrevocably upon Miss Hartwell, consider, the knife is hidden beneath the floor in a place unlikely to be discovered immediately. With it, a scrap bearing her name. When at last the weapon is found, the evidence appears conclusive. The police, already inclined toward her guilt, would close the case with satisfaction. And you? I was to provide confirmation, said Holmes quietly. My reputation would lend weight to the conclusion. A masterstroke, had it succeeded. But it did not, said I eagerly. You spoke of an absence in the floor cavity. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, now we come to the crux. The cavity beneath the floor was clean, too clean, no dust, no accumulated debris, no sign that the board had remained undisturbed for any length of time. The knife had not lain there since the night of the crime. It had been placed there recently, very recently. After the police had begun their investigation? Exactly. And who, Watson, had both the opportunity and the necessity to place it there at such a time? Pencomb, I said slowly. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantelpiece. The scrap of paper we found in the passage confirms it. It matches the torn edge of the note discovered beneath the floor. He prepared it in haste, perhaps intending to place it with the knife, but dropped the fragment on his way. A small oversight, but sufficient. And the murder itself? Holmes turned. Committed in anger, not premeditation. Pencomb quarrelled with Adrian Vane, likely over money, perhaps over some document or obligation. In the heat of the moment he seized a knife from the room and struck. Realizing what he had done, he removed the weapon and escaped by the side door. And later, I added, he conceived the plan to frame Miss Hartwell. Just so. Her known quarrels with the deceased made her an ideal suspect. By introducing the knife and the incriminating paper after the fact, he transformed suspicion into apparent certainty. I sank back in my chair. It is devilishly clever. It is clever, said Holmes, but not flawless. The best-laid plans fail when they neglect the smallest detail. And now? Holmes reached for his coat. Now we shall pay a final visit to Marchfield House. Inspector Lestrade will, I think, be most interested in our conclusions. It was near midnight when we returned. It accompanied by Lestrade, whose sharp features bore that expression of eager scepticism which I had come to know well. Pencomb was summoned to the morning room, where Holmes stood beside the hearth, the very spot where Adrian Vane had met his end. "You have something to tell us, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "I have," returned Holmes, "and I shall be brief. Mr. Pencomb, you murdered Adrian Vane." The solicitor did not start, but his face grew very still. "This is an outrageous accusation." "It is a precise one," said Holmes. "You quarrelled with him. You killed him in anger. You removed the weapon and later concealed it beneath the floor, together with a fabricated piece of evidence intended to implicate Miss Hartwell. Unfortunately for you, the concealment was too recent and your preparation incomplete." Pencomb's eyes flickered. "Yes, you have no proof." Holmes produced the fragment of paper. "This, found in the passage, matches the torn edge of the scrap beneath the floor. It was dropped by you. Furthermore, your access to the house, your use of the side door, and your knowledge of the household's tensions all point in one direction, and one only." There was a long silence. Then, with a sudden, bitter laugh, Pencomb sank into a chair. "Very well," he said. "You have it." Miss Hartwell, who had been brought to the doorway, gave a low cry. Mrs. Vane, supported by a servant, stood pale but resolute. "It was not meant to happen," Pencomb continued. "He was a fool, reckless, demanding money he had no right to. He threatened exposure, ruin. I lost my temper, that is all." "And the rest?" said Holmes coldly. "A necessity," he answered. What, or so I believed. Lestrade stepped forward. That will do, sir. Some days later, as Holmes sat once more in his accustomed chair, I could not resist recalling the affair. It is extraordinary, said I, how near Miss Hartwell came to ruin. Holmes shrugged lightly. The truth, Watson, is often buried, but rarely beyond recovery. And the knife beneath the floorboard? A symbol, said he with a faint smile. Not of the crime, but of the folly of believing that one can hide the truth by placing it out of sight. He leaned back, his eyes already distant. Come, my dear fellow, he added, I think we may allow ourselves a quieter problem until the next absurdity presents itself. And with that, the matter of the knife beneath the floorboard passed into that long catalogue of cases which, though closed to the world, remain vivid in the memory of those who witnessed them.